Thank you for joining me today in this talk and slideshow about the artist Jessie Traill. Jessie Traill was one of the greatest Australian printmakers of the 20th century, a woman who lived a remarkable life of art, travel and humanitarian work. I've been researching Jessie Traill's life for a number of years, and some of the sources I used were in the State Library of Victoria, where I was fortunate to receive a creative fellowship to research Jessie's life and work. Jessie's work is found in all the state galleries in Australia, and there's an extensive collection in the National Gallery of Australia. Some of you may have seen a wonderful exhibition of her work in 2013 as it travelled to regional Australia. We'll look out this year for an exhibition and events at the National Gallery called Know My Name, which celebrates 150 Australian women artists, and Jessie was chosen as one of them. And I was honoured to write the entry for Jessie in the Know My Name publication. On my journey, I met many wonderful people who knew Jessie and have enriched my knowledge of her work and understanding of her nature. People have said to me, "You must feel you know her so well." Well, any life is very complex, but I hope I've done Jessie justice. People who met her at different times of her life had different impressions of her, but I found the most telling factor was of how people saw her was their personalities. To many, she was known for her kindness and empathy. To some, her lack of concern for social niceties meant they saw her as eccentric. In her diary writing and letters, her sense of humour emerges, and in her art and travel essays, her powers of observation and love of the natural world is clear. So let me tell you a little more about Jessie Traill. Jessie was born in 1881 in Brighton at a house called Westra. She was the youngest of 4 girls. Her father, George Hamilton Traill, was a bank manager, and he had lost his first wife and son in the wreck of the SS London in the Bay of Biscay in 1867. He later married Jessie's mother, who was 17 years younger than her. Jessie's sisters, here we see Elsie on the left, who was a scholar, an early student of Melbourne University in the classics, Minna and Kathleen on the right, and both Minna and Kathleen became religious sisters at the Community of the Holy Name in Cheltenham, Victoria. None of the sisters married or had children. Living in Brighton in the late 1800s was on the edge of the city of Melbourne. The shores were lined with tea tree, as we see on the left, and people would come fully dressed to the bay to enjoy the water. The Traill family then moved to Glenmore, a house called Glenmore at Black Rock, which was on Bluff Road and Stanley Street. When Jessie was 10 years old on Black Rock Beach, she remembers meeting Tom Roberts, who was there painting plein air. He would have been about 35 years old at the time. Her father bought some of his paintings, and later Tom Roberts became a lifelong mentor for Jessie. The life for Jessie and her sisters was a Victorian childhood, but tragedy struck when Jessie was 12 years old. The girl's mother died, and Kathleen became the female head of the household. And I think as a result of this, that they missed out on the social introductions, which would have been enabled by their mother had she still been around. And so, apart from some men at church and some of their cousins. They didn't have a lot to do with young men. Jessie was the baby of the family and had a lot more freedom than the other girls. She enjoyed nature and drawing. Here we see her playing with her dog, Don, in the garden at Glenmore. And on the right-hand side, she writes at 17 years old a letter to her cousin, Austin. She sounds in the letter quite a lot younger, but at the top we can see this lovely little drawing, which is quite humorous, to remind him of his visit to them. From 1901 to 1906, Jessie attended the National Arts School in Melbourne. Her drawing teacher was Frederick McCubbin, and the painting teacher and director was Bernard Hall. And here we can see Jessie on the left-hand photo, just peeping around the first woman on the left, looking a little shyly. And in the right-hand photo, she's on the right top corner. Here she had a wonderful time developing her art practice, making friends with other artists, many of whom became lifelong friends, and enjoying life as a young woman in Melbourne at the time. There's a wonderful notebook that has been preserved and is in Jessie's papers at the State Library of Victoria, and it documents her learning etching with John Mather at the time. He had the first etching press in Australia, and here we have some of Jessie's early attempts at etching. Her humour comes out in her comments about her work here. In this one we read, "Ground worked twice, lines too far apart, no mysterious depths, drawing sketchy, confused and altogether a failure. Mr. Mather could not tell which way up." During this time, Elsie graduated from Melbourne University and became involved in community charity work and was an early member of the Lyceum Club. Kathleen, who we see on the right, was a sister in the community of the Holy Name, and here we see her with some orphans at their orphanage there. In 1907, George Hamilton took Minna and Jessie to Europe for a tour of art. He was in his 70s by then, and he passed away in Rome. Jessie and Minna organised his funeral and burial there, and then they went on to London. Minna went and stayed at an Anglican women's order in Haggleston in the East End of London, and Jessie enrolled at the London School of Art with Frank Brangwyn to study etching. Brangwyn's new style, it's hard to imagine now, but was quite radical at the time. He was making large prints, and he was leaving what's called plate tone on the surface of the plate to create depth. That's where, instead of wiping all the ink off the plate, it's just wiped off in selective places. He was working with industrial subjects and the natural world, two things that influenced Jessie's work. Jessie attended one of his summer schools in France in 1907, and here she produced this print, The Roadside Flanders, and we can see her experimenting with tone here and the painterly effect of wiping certain areas of the print where they are white completely, but leaving plate tone to add depth in other areas. During Jessie's time in London, the Roberts family were also living there. Tom Roberts had had a house built out near Hampstead Heath, and Jessie and other artists often visited there. He was working on what he called his big picture, the opening of the Australian Federal Parliament. Jessie and other friends enjoyed their time there, especially Sunday lunches in the garden. There were fruit trees, and Lily was very generous in making food for everybody. And it was a real homely place for Jessie at that time. During her time in London, Jessie also enrolled in Academy Colarossi in Paris for a term. And we can see her here on the left-hand side of the picture. And in Paris, of course, she came into contact with other art influences of the time, and also would have seen Japanese prints, which influenced her printmaking practice. I was very fortunate in 2015 to be able to find and travel to some of the places where Jessie worked and studied. And here we have Stratford Studios, where the London School of Art was located. The bottom picture shows one of the academies in the same street as the one Jessie attended. It was still open, and I was able to go inside and see things very much as Jessie had described them. On the right-hand side, we have Tom Roberts' house in Golders Green, where she used to visit in London. And you can see that the large room in the front of the house is what Roberts had the house designed to include a large studio. So it was wonderful to see those firsthand. In 1909, Jessie and Minna returned home, and they sold the Glenmore estate. You can see here an advertisement for the sale. It was divided into many lots, and the advertisement talks about the wonderful position, the panoramic views of the bay, the tram service from Sandringham Railway Station along Beach Road, and the train line back into Melbourne. Jessie and Elsie went on to buy another property in the area, and they built a house that they called Stronza. Jessie bought an etching press, and here we see on the right the press at Stronza Studio, and she also took a studio in Temple Court, where a lot of artists were working in Melbourne, and began to really produce some wonderful prints. Some of the things that she had produced in London, like this scaffolding of the building of Melbourne House in London, were exhibited in the Royal Academy London and in the Salon in Paris. But back home in Australia, Jessie returned to the environment she knew so well. In 1910, she produced the tea tree frieze that was so reminiscent of her childhood along Port Phillip Bay. In 1914, she printed The Drinking Man, which was based on work from France. And also in 1914, this triptych, Man and Nature, and each panel is individually titled. The first one is The Gift, the second, The Sacrifice, and third, The Reward. And here we see her environmental consciousness, which was unusual for the time, as she saw land being cleared for farming. In 1914, she produced this beautiful print, and it's called Beautiful Victims. It's men bring barking trees. It won a gold medal at an international exhibition. But at the end of 1914, World War I had broken out, and Jessie booked herself a passage to England to help care for the casualties of World War I. Here we see her in her VAD uniform. So she joined a voluntary aid detachment, St John's Ambulance. She trained firstly in London at Gifford House, and she wrote a wonderful piece about her time there and drew this humorous little cartoon on the left of a day in the life at Gifford House, showing her getting up, sweeping, bringing teas to the men, going for a walk after washing up in the afternoon, and finally, after a concert, to bed. Jessie is in the photo on the right-hand side. She's on the left of that photo, preparing teas, and this would have been something quite different for her back at home. They were a well-to-do family who would have had a maid, possibly a cook, to prepare food. So Jessie was on a pretty steep learning curve, as were other middle-class young women who volunteered. Jessie was then stationed in France in July 1915 at number 12 British Military Hospital, which was in the form of tents on the racecourse on the edge of the town of Rouen in northwestern France. And so they were camping. But this was something that Jessie quite enjoyed, and she wrote a diary through her war years, which was based on letters that she wrote back home. And that diary is in the State Library of Victoria, and it was wonderful reading. And so Jessie spent quite a long time here. Later that year, she was transferred to number 8 General Hospital, which was at Brighton in the north of Rouen. And here she showed us the officers' ward on the left. They get to have curtains and bedspreads, and the Tommy's ward on the right. She wrote beautifully about her time here, although she had very little time to write. It was hard work and long hours. But she wrote about the young men, she called them her lambs, who she was looking after. Some were only boys, the flowers that she brought them, and the food that they made for them. Because Jessie was there for so long, she did end up doing a lot of nursing duties beyond what the VADs normally did. So she was involved in looking after dressings on some of the horrific wounds that were there. But nevertheless, she remained positive and describes beautifully on her few days off her ventures into the French countryside. During the time Jessie was serving there, she worked also at what was called the Six Sisters Hospital. So this was a building, a chateau as she called it, not far from the main hospital, where sisters who became unwell while they were serving were housed. And the people looking after them, including Jessie, stayed in tents in the grounds. And Jessie also slept in this summer house that we see on the right in the garden. And there's also a photo of the nurses on the little bridge in the extensive grounds there. I was very fortunate to be able to find who owns this house now. The Billiard family. Philippe Billiard has been there since his family bought the house in 1937, and he's lived there since 1939. It's been transformed and renovated beautifully, but the family is very conscious of its history as a part of the World War I effort. And we can see in the grounds here, they have just rebuilt the little bridge, as we saw in the previous photo. And on the mound to the right, Philippe remembers as a boy the summer house that he used to play in, where Jessie had slept. In between their busy labours, the sisters working there managed to build a tennis court, and here we see them pulling the roller on the tennis court. Jessie made many friends here, and on the right she titled this photo 5 Splendid Sisters, and we see Jessie second from the right wearing an armband for her years of service there. Every 6 months they had to sign on again to continue to serve, and Jessie ended up being one of the longest serving women there. Nearby we have the reminder of the cost of World War I on the left from Jessie's album, the nearby cemetery as it was then with the wooden crosses, and to the right as the cemetery looks now with the beautiful graves, the gravestones made by the Commonwealth War Commission, and it's so beautifully cared for. While Jessie was working near Rouen, she found that she had some French relatives on her father's side who lived about 10 kilometres away in the village of Quincampoix, and she started to make trips out to see them. And we can see their chateau here, La Bouquiale, on the right-hand side. She managed to procure a bicycle, which she named Tutu, and when she could, she would ride out to see her relatives. Here again, she had a sense of family, which she so valued, and she kept up with her French family, visiting them many times in the following years after the war finished. This is La Bouquiale now. It has been in the family for many years, but then was sold to as a convent. And in the grounds, when I was visiting there, I saw this Normandy barn, which I had heard that Jessie's studio was based on a Normandy barn, and I realised that it was very much the same size and shape. The staff of the hospitals put on concerts for the men, and on the left here we see the women dressed up in all sorts of costumes. Jessie was involved in making some of these for the concerts to try to cheer up the soldiers. And then in 1919, after the war was finished, the hospitals took a long time to clear, and Jessie stayed on. And during that winter of 1918, 1919, the rules among the staff loosened a little, and they were able to go sledding in the snow and talk to the military officers, which had not been allowed before. Jessie arrived back in Australia, and in the 1920s she continued to visit the Roberts, who were back also, and Tom Roberts continued to give her support for her artwork, and she was a great friend of the family. Elsie and Jessie had also bought a block of land in Harkaway in the foothills of the Dandenongs in 1912, and they built a house called Hafra in the 1920s there. The Traills had known the Hafra area through friendship with the Boyd family, who had a house in Hafra, in Harkaway, sorry. And that connection continued on. In fact, later Jessie taught Arthur Boyd the etching process. And now back in Australia in the 20s, Jessie entered into another period of wonderful paintings and etchings. This is one of her most well-known and loved works, a particular favourite of mine. It's called Good Night in the Gully Where the White Gums Grow, and she produced this in 1922. You can see the Art Nouveau influence here, the organic forms, and it was quite unusual for the time to have the trees extending out of the picture frame. But we can see here her influence is even felt on people like Fred Williams, the painter, in future years. Her print here on the left, Japanese Mount Warning, 1921, shows the Japanese influence on prints in the Western world at the time. And on the right, we have a picture of Jessie in what was called rational dress for women, where she extols the practicality of being able to wear leggings and a loose gabardine jacket when she's out in the field drawing and painting. Jessie had got to know a number of refugees in France during the war, and she was very concerned for the loss of their homes and livelihoods in the eastern part of France. So when she returned home, she set up an appeal for these refugees, particularly at a little town called Fouchy, where some of the people, particularly an old grandmother who she got to know at the house at La Pouquiale, had come from. In 1926, Jessie revisited England and France and visited the town of Fouchy, and here we have her holding a bunch of flowers. They had a wonderful ceremony to thank her for the funds raised, which helped widows and children, helped rebuild the water supply in Fouchy. While Jessie was back in France, she went back to visit her family at La Pouquiale, and it was here that she met the 2-year-old daughter of her second cousin, and her name is Francois Cachou. I was very happy and delighted to meet Francois in 2015 when she was 92. She gave me these photos of Jessie's visit in 1926, and I was able to send a copy of my biography of Jessie to Francois this year, and because of the COVID lockdown, her granddaughter was able to translate it into French, and I received some lovely emails back from them telling me how much she had enjoyed the book. Back home in 1928, Jessie made a visit to Central Australia via the Flinders Ranges with a friend, and she held a watercolour exhibition at Alice Springs, the first one by a white person there. She visited again in 1932 with Violet Teague, and the young Albert Namatjira was their cameleer, cook and attendant on their trip. It's now acknowledged that their influence on his watercolour painting came before Rex Batterby's in 1934. Jessie was a great traveller around Australia and overseas. She wrote many essays of her journeys, and there's many extracts of her essays in my book. She had a car and made car journeys from Queensland to Victoria. She sometimes made trips with Sister Kathleen, and I love these photos from her album. The top one is on a 5-day walk in the Baw Baws with Kathleen, and we can see her in her full habit and the hut where they stayed. Quite basic. The lower picture is Kathleen again with her full habit, paddling on Phillip Island with Violet Teague. And Jessie, of course, was there taking the photo. In 1924, Jessie visited Malakuta, which is still quite isolated. It's now become known this year for the big fire evacuation from the bushfires. It's otherwise still a very beautiful and peaceful place, and Jessie made a number of prints and sketches during her time there. She also continued to paint and make prints of industrial subjects. Here on the left we have the big building at Yallourn, and she made a number of trips to Sydney during the building of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. She would visit every 6 months between 1927 and 1932 and made a wonderful series of etchings of the building of the bridge. And this final one called Red Light Harbour Bridge on the right, with the completed bridge scene. There were comments made at the time in newspapers of her understanding and accuracy of engineering drawing. Jessie had many close friends, and she often travelled with them and visited them. In 1938, she went to the UK to stay with her friend Belle near Alnwick in Northumberland in the northeast of England. Belle was a friend from their World War I years, serving in France, and they had kept up. Because of the outbreak of World War II in 1939, Jessie was unable to return home, and so she ended up spending the whole of the Second World War with Belle in Northumberland until she could return in 1946. The Robertson family, Belle's family, still live there, and I was very fortunate to track them down, and they invited me to come and stay and to see the area. And they showed me this wonderful mural which goes right round one of their bedrooms that Jessie painted when she was there during the Second World War. And then out of a suitcase in a wardrobe, they brought 2 aprons with Jessie and Belle's names embroidered on them, their aprons from their service during World War I. During her time there, Jessie was able to make some etchings at the Newcastle Art School using their presses. And we see here on the left the picture of the blackout at night. And then on the right-hand side, this one is called Their Time Has Come, and again shows her environmental concern for trees being felled in the area. In 1946, Jessie had the sad news that Elsie was very unwell. And so Jessie travelled back to Australia by flying boat, which was an expensive way to travel, but the fastest way. It took 5 days at the time. And on her trip, she made a number of watercolour images out the window. And she put them into albums which with her papers. Sadly, Elsie passed away 2 days before Jessie returned home. And so by this time, there was just the 3 of the sisters left. Jessie made further flights in Australia and painted a number of watercolours which she put into albums looking out the window. They're quite interesting in the context of her other work. The lack of horizon line in these pictures makes them more abstract and shows her interest in pattern and composition. Jessie lived at her studio in Harkaway in the later years of her life. Elsie and Jessie had sold the house halfway next door, and Jessie just lived in her studio here. I met her second cousin, Sheila Galbraith, who stayed there in the 1950s, and she let me have copies of these photos of hers. Here we see Jessie living still quite a simple life. They were cooking on this outdoor stove, By this time, Kathleen had passed away and there was just Minna and Jessie. Minna here we see doing some cooking. Sheila remembers a lot of bread and honey and tea being consumed during her time there. Jessie stayed at the studio until the last months of her life before she passed away in 1967. She wrote letters to friends and sat by the burning fire with her artwork around her. And there are some beautiful letters with her friend, the sculptor Ola Cohen, who I've also put extracts in my book. They're also held in the State Library of Victoria. Near the beginning of my research, I was able to find where Jessie's studio was and visit there. It was quite an incredible story where the local historical society told me that it had just been sold and gave me the phone number of the real estate agent who had sold it, who I contacted, and surprisingly, because they don't usually do this, he gave me the phone number of the person that owned it. When I rang him and explained that I was writing a biography of Jessie Traill, whose studio it had been, and asked if I could visit, he said that he was loaning it to a writer friend, and that if he wasn't home, he would let him know that I was visiting, but if he wasn't home, that I could climb over the front gate and walk up and look at the studio. So I was very happy the day that I was able to do just that and walk up this driveway with the towering gums and come around the corner and see the studio very much as it had been when Jessie lived there. I was glad I was on my own. The only sounds were the bird song in the trees, and I almost felt like I was going to meet Jessie herself. I was able to look in the windows and see the southern window within the studio with the soft light coming in, so suitable for artwork, and imagine her there sitting by the fire. So it's been a wonderful journey. I've only given you a little glimpse into it. And so if you would like to read more, my biography, Jessie Traill, has been published by Australian Scholarly Publishing, and it can be bought through them directly at their website or through your local bookshop where it can be ordered. And if you do get a chance to go to Canberra in the coming 6 months, there is this wonderful Know My Name exhibition starting on the 14th of November this year and going through to July next year, of Australian women artists, 1900 to now. And Jessie's print, Good Night in the Gully, Where the White Gums Grow, is part of that exhibition, as well as many other works, some of which may not have been seen before, to celebrate the wonderful tradition we have here of women artists working in Australia. So thank you so much for listening and sharing this talk and slideshow today. I hope you have enjoyed it, and wherever you are, that you are able to access and find out more about Jessie and other women artists. Thank you.